Uniquely positioned as the longest base range AD carry in the game, and with a playstyle that greatly rewards strong laning and teamfighting fundamentals, Caitlyn is a champion that I would highly recommend investing your time into. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of Caitlyn's champion identity and what success looks like in games that you are doing well in her. We'll then discuss different components of her kit and how we can work better to optimize each one of these. This includes going over different matchups, rune optimizations, ability maxing, your build, pathing, and how to play out each phase of the game. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and sub for more content like this. High level, Caitlyn is best described as a very lane-dominant AD carry, sitting as the only champion in the game with a base 650 range. Her playstyle thrives off of her being able to take advantage of this to dominate the lane phase, and then subsequently translate these leads into free advantages throughout the map. She carries a ton of carry potential thanks to her ability to siege and choke out objectives as well. Let's kick things off with runes for Cait, which are relatively standard as far as AD carries go. Her most common keystone to take is lethal tempo, which for her is really easy to proc thanks to her super long range. Because Cait can get a lot of free auto attacks on lane, it allows her to get ahead in lethal tempo stacks compared to her lane opponents, and can prevent enemies from being able to stat check her in terms of all-ins. The rest of her runes basically supplement this fact as well as cover up whatever needs she doesn't naturally fulfill with her standard items right now. The typical precision tree for her would include lethal tempo, presence of mind, legend bloodline, and coup de grace or cut down depending on the enemy team composition. Her secondary tree also revolves around taking advantage of this laning dominance under normal circumstances. By default, she tends to take absolute focus and gathering storm for her secondary. Since in a lot of matchups, it's very hard for her to sustain a lot of harass for free, she technically gains a very high amount of uptime for absolute focus. Gathering Storm tends to also be a good default take for her because of the current meta being relatively slow. In some matchups, Cait can take a fair bit of harass since her lane opponents might have a lot of poke or otherwise. It's quite important overall that Caitlyn has a lot of uptime when it comes to staying in lane, and without a lot of sustain options that she can go for in her build, she has to make some adaptations to her runes in order to compensate for this. The two main versions of this will be to switch her secondary tree to a domination version, focus on taking advantage of Taste of Blood, along with either Ingenious Hunter or Treasure Hunter has her other rune in that tree. Alternatively, it's also okay to switch your keystone to Fleet Footwork in some situations as well. This requires a bit of thought as to how your fights play out, as Fleet Footwork can also be taken in scenarios where a standard front to back might be punishing for Cait. Before your game starts, consider the amount of poke that you have in lane and the way your fights play out, and then you can adjust your runes accordingly. For adaptive runes, the standard attack speed, adaptive force, and resistance item of choice will be a great set to work with in pretty much any scenario. Moving on to her items and build, Caitlyn follows a relatively standard take that most crit reliant AD carries will opt for. For her mythic item, she pretty much opts for Gale Force in most scenarios. It rounds out her relatively little mobility really well, combos well with some of her abilities, and gives that little bit of damage that she needs in order to assassinate people in the mid game. The only other mythic I would potentially consider here is Kraken Slayer, but the situations that you'll be using this are very rare, as that would mean there is a combination of no engage on the enemy team and that you'll be needing to DPS a ton. For secondary items, your most common takes are going to be things like the Collector, Rapid Fire Cannon, or Lord Dominic's Regards. The Collector should be your default item if the enemy has a team comp in which they will be building a low amount of armor. You should swap your second item to LDR if the inverse is true and the enemy has a pretty tanky frontline, and RFC can be taken instead of Collector if the enemy can threaten you if you walk into your normal attack range. Infinity Edge should always generally be your third item in this case, and your items from there are generally going to be defensive, answering whatever threats against you. This could mean getting RFC if you haven't already, picking up a Bloodthirster so you can last longer in a front and back scenario, or even things like QSS or GA if the enemy has either a ton of CC or individual kill threat. Caitlyn relies on her core items very greatly in order to scale her damage consistently, so I would not worry too much about adapting your build, especially for the first three items. Now moving on to combos and ability usage, and in this section we'll be covering some of the most fundamental combos that Caitlyn has, as well as some good usage tips overall. At the highest level, Caitlyn combos are much easier than they were in the past, so she's become much more inviting and easier to play in that sense. The main combos she has revolve around animation cancelling her net, in which you can cast either your Q or W while pressing E. EQ is a great combo because the net from her E slows enough to set up for Q, while the trap combo is great for creating space during a pinch, such as a team fight. In general, Caitlyn can also input her traps in between her auto attack windows to effectively maximize her damage uptime. In scenarios where she's DPSing against enemies, putting these traps down while damaging them makes dueling her much more tricky than against normal champions. In general, your traps can also be used to take control of terrain relating to objectives, putting it around corners of walls where optimal pathing is, or putting them in bushes or behind turrets where it's very hard for the enemy to see them are great ways to force the enemy to think about it. Into these matchups, it's very important to have razor sharp awareness of the enemy's engage range, as well as whether your current lane state is a safe one. In general, although Caitlyn is granted a free advantage in most of her matchups, it only takes a couple of seconds for that to get completely turned on its head. When it comes to matchups, thanks to her raw range advantage most of the time, Caitlyn has a very generous and favorable matchup curve against almost every other bot lane in the game. She fares the worst against champions that have tools in the kit that can either answer her range or can close the gap such that her range advantage is no longer relevant. Champions like Jhin and Misfortune cause her normal auto attack trading patterns to be very funky, while the Kaisas and Samiras of the world turn those matchups into very volatile ones. Against the engaged AD carries, Caitlyn still fares really well since she still carries a massive range advantage in the beginning of the game, but the moment she dies to those champions once or twice, it becomes extremely difficult to catch up. So you have to be very aware of your range advantage in each matchup and use every opportunity you can to get free damage on your opponent with these auto attacks. This free harass typically translates into you being able to get free damage onto the enemy turret as well, well, which is a necessary move in order to extend your advantage. In this state, you have to time when you crash the wave such that either the enemy jungler cannot punish you in this case, or you have tools to answer it. In teamfights, great Caitlyn play is all about taking advantage of her incredible range and dancing just outside of danger so that she can maximize her DPS output. One small fact about Caitlyn is that she actually has a special attack speed ratio, so she generally scales worse with attack speed than your standard AD carry. Because of this, as well as the fact that she is rewarded with more safety and range than the average AD carry, the Caitlyn player needs to compensate for this fact by putting out as much absolute damage as possible. Standard AD carry fundamentals apply. Be cognizant of the enemy engaged threats and how far they can come in from, and adjust your DPS tools accordingly. If it feels that you have to be at risk if you walk up to your auto attack range, then use tools like your Q and ultimate in order to still output damage wherever possible. Overall, Caitlyn is one of the most difficult yet rewarding AD carries in the game to play around. In the right hands, she feels like an extremely impressive champion to play, and she is a fan favorite for many players when she becomes even remotely good. As always though, hope this guide was insightful to you guys, and I will catch you in the next one. Stay fresh.